Okay, so let's talk about design intent. Design intent is the way that the software remembers how you drew every single line, right? How you drew the arc, where you placed the points, from what line you drew an offset, every single thing, right? So, or the first part of the design intent is what tool you decided to pick to draw your line. You know, a line that's drawn with a line between points tool is going to react differently to changes down the line, later, compared to a line that you drew using a simple line 2 element or like a curved line 2 element. You might say they're both just lines, right? But the software will remember what tool you use to draw that specific line, and that's what it's going to use to be able to determine how it will react to future changes. So let me show you a quick example of that. So if I draw, say for example, another line between points here, notice that this one has a snap, and actually notice how this one has the bubbles come up in the middle and on both ends. But since this one is snapped, it's kind of showing the glyph of the snap here, right? And so obviously the bubble's still there. If you hover over it, it'll be there and you can move it and unsnap it. But because the computer remembers that you snapped, and that's one of the other forms of design intent, is the snaps, it'll kind of, hide the bubble for a second there to show you that it's snapped there. And so if you move something like that, and say for example now you move one of these, well, now it's snapped and it stays, right? But other than that, since it's a line between points, it's saying, well, I'm trying to attach the first point of this line to the second point of this first line, and then the other point, I'm just making sure that I'm keeping the X and Y value that was input when this second line was drawn, right? Now, if you say something like, I snap it to this other line here, well, now neither of the bubbles show up unless I go look for them specifically, right? And that's because now it's snapped to both sides. And so now if I move this line here, it's trying to keep both of these snaps as its points. But say for example, if I do a simple line, let's say a line from element, and I select this line here, so I select start point, and I say something like that, right? That's a kind of a weird way to draw it, but whatever. You're snapping to this particular point here, and it's drawing here. So now, if I were to move it, let's say, let me try to match it to make it look like the other one, right? So I'm going to try to match it to look, right? So now, technically, it's snapped to the end of this line, right? But whenever I move something like that, notice how it's different in the sense of it's keeping that same bearing. So that's different from this one, because like if I try to do something like that and then match it, see, it's reacting differently, right? And that's because the tools are different. So this one will keep that same bearing, and that's because of the simple line from element tool that's making it react that way. So that's kind of a simple way of showing how different tools, even though they both drew lines that were, maybe at the beginning snapped at the endpoints of the first line, it'll react differently once the first line changes because of the tool that was used for the second line. And so I've also currently been explaining all of this using first line, second line, right? But the correct terminology for these would be a parent line and a child line, right? So the parent line obviously is the one that came first, the one that was drawn first, and then the child is the one that depends on the parent line in some way, whether that be through the bearing of the parent line or through the snap to the parent line, right? Another way to change design intent is directly through these. So you can make this a 40, and now whenever I make changes here, it'll try to honor that 50-degree bearing, right? So now instead of trying to snap to this thing or trying to snap to an X and Y value, those were superseded by the hard coding of the bearing that I've placed in here. And now that's how the computer believes that I want that line to react, right? To hold the snap and to hold the bearing. If I were to say, let's see, and so that's the other thing too, right? So even though these are two lines and they were snapped originally at the ends of each other, because this line was drawn with a simple tool or simple line from elements, there's different inputs, right? You can't really use, you don't really have the bearing and the length, right? You have here more how far the initial starting point is, and then the length of the line. So just bear that in mind, that depending on the tool that you use, and then later on the changes that you make to these readouts and the snaps that you place as you're drawing the lines will depend on how those lines interact with future changes. Okay, so quick thing on the side here. You can change this. Let's say, for example, I want a 35-degree, 45-minute, 15-second bearing, right? So you could type in N35, 45, 15 east, and then it'll make that change there.